It has been a long time, and it's been very worthwhile. So I've been hearing two questions a lot in the last 3 days, walking back and forth to the hotel or coffee break or whatever. And one of the questions people all want to know is there going to be an Arctic Futures 2051 or another question? And the answer is no. It is not our intent to create an annual meeting. We have plenty of annual meetings. It was our intent to try to shift the conversation. I think we've succeeded to some extent, but not entirely. The other question people have been asking me is, well, how's it going? How do you feel about the meeting? And I feel mixed about the meeting. I mean, we have made some progress, but I think it all became really clear to me when Sandra Nutuk was asked a similar question this morning about the work that you heard her talk about. And she said, and I hope I get this close to right, she says, well, I have not felt entirely celebratory because the system should have already been there. And that's sort of, I guess, how I'm feeling. It's like, well, maybe we've made some progress. We're going to take some time for it all to sort of settle in. But even if we've made some progress, it isn't enough. It isn't enough in terms of the justice issues, clearly. And it isn't enough to divert the disaster that we're all facing. So I feel kind of mixed about that. And then another comment today that I want to kind of highlight was one that Henry Huntington made. He said, well, look, you have to understand, climate change is just gas being poured on fires that are already burning. And he had several really good examples. In that same panel, Beth Marino, I think really, she said, well, I'm going to condense all these years of research into a short statement, which she did beautifully, I thought. But she made the point that colonization is stamped deeply into our power structures. And that's important for us to take home and recognize, and that means how we do science, how policymakers make policy, how communication happens. And then Delbert Pungawe got up here and reminded us that we are only stewards here. And that humble sense of our place in all of this, I think is a really important thing to walk away with. Only thing I know how to do is to go back to that different tent that I talked about on the morning of the first day, and remember what Conrad told me and that student in Savunga, which is learn what you need from different knowledge systems. We've explored what's working and what's not working in that space, and have realized we got lots more to do, lots more. And that comes back to this question, are we going to do this again? I don't think it would be helpful for a search organization like that to sort of say, well, let's make an annual event of getting together and having this meeting, because I think other people need to take this up. And maybe it's people, indigenous people in their turf, maybe it's political people on their turf. I'm hopeful that people will say, there is something to the idea of getting people together, these three voices, and there's probably more. People point out industry wasn't here. That's true, they should have been. That's not a 400 people meeting now, that's an 800 people meeting, excuse me. So I'm just going to say, let's carry this on. Let's figure out where the next best place is to continue this conversation. What I have heard people say consistently is the idea that we didn't have a bunch of experts standing up here giving overly long PowerPoint presentations and showing their data and puffing themselves up, but rather we tried to make it about a conversation. People seem to like that. I think it's important. It does go to this point of the importance of stories. And Fran, I appreciate the kind words, but obviously this is an idea that lots of people have had. The time was ripe, and we've had a tremendous, a lot of people, including a lot of people in this room, helped conceive of this and make it a reality. certainly the Search Science Steering Committee, who don't get paid for what they do. They give their time to try to direct the efforts of Search, including putting on this meeting. The steering committee devoted even more of their time and put up with my constant harassments for the last year. No meeting on Wednesday, guys. We're not doing that. And the funders are really important. The National Science Foundation's been extremely generous. Department of Energy, NASA, NOAA, Pew, Moore Foundation, BOEM. I'm probably leaving somebody out. Holler out, please. But that's really important because we brought something like 60 Indigenous and early career scientists here because of that very important funding. And we have great partners. They're listed in the book, like the Wilson Center that put on that scenario exercise yesterday, ArcticNet and others. But I also want to give a shout out for the people who lead from behind, right? People who don't put themselves out front, won't necessarily come up to the podium, but they really influence the rest of us. And I think of Simon Stevenson at NSF, who has been leading behind on sort of this Arctic science policy, Indigenous community effort in a very quiet but very effective way. And Rochelle Daniel would be another one. She eventually consented to being up here to moderate that very good Indigenous knowledge panel. Her preference would have been to have other people up there doing it, but she leads from behind with great aplomb. So where do we go with this? I guess what I would just say is that as more gas hits more fires, I really like that, Henry. That's really inspired. It's not, as I said yesterday, going to bring out our higher angels. You know, we're going to get really testy with each other. I don't know about you, but you know, my wife and I find, you know, she says, well, neither of us were very buffered. That's usually what we say the next day after we've had a fight, right? Is that for whatever reason, things happening in work or health or something, you lose that buffer and you start getting short and unclear and testy. And I think that's going to happen to us as the gas hits these fires. There's more and more stress. More and more people are falling through the ice. More and more people are struggling with untruthful politicians. More and more people are struggling with funding problems. We're all going to be unbuffered and we're going to get grouchy with each other. And I don't know of any other antidote for that. And you may, and please pick it up if you do, except for one that I learned from watching Harry's father and Tom Albert, who took this very severe, not a climate crisis, but a very severe crisis to the communities in northern Alaska. Like, oh, by the way, your 2,000-year-old tradition of whaling is now over, and said, no, we're not going to let that happen. And you know, the colonial structure was even worse then. The imbalance of power was worse then. But they stood up and they said, no, we're going to sit down with these people and talk this through. And it didn't go well. There, you know, it's like, I think in that early era, what used to happen is they would get the scientists and the managers and the whalers together in hotels in Anchorage, and they would have very, very difficult, tense meetings. And I'm pretty sure they were all tremendously relieved when they had a chance to go to lunch and just tend to debrief. And, you know, one group would go to one place for lunch, another would go to another, and this kind of repeated. But eventually, inevitably as it happens, they ended up at the same restaurant for lunch, and awkwardly in tables very close to one another. And I don't know, Mike, you were there, but at some point, people said, well, you know, maybe we should pull these tables together. And I could just imagine people thinking, oh, I really just needed a break from this. But what happens when people eat together and talk together and then see each other again and again is this odd thing happens, is suddenly, oh, your kid plays soccer too? Oh, that's really, yeah. Oh, what, you like to fish too? Those human connections form. That's this magic relationship thing we've been talking about, is forming human connections. So I really appreciate Nikush's pointing out that, well, this is not entirely comfortable for us, and this hasn't really worked perfectly. But she also acknowledged and put out there the willingness to keep at it. And that's what it's going to take, and that's another kind of leadership. So there isn't going to be an Arctic Futures 2051 in this format, but I hope there will be in formats that are derivative of this. And I think we should all go get a drink and call it good. So thank you. But before we do, I do want to stress that there's a lot of hard work behind the scenes on this, and tremendous staff of ARCUS, National Academy staff, and Andrea Fisher sitting here, who's worked miracles for a year now, and certainly the Indigenous Participation Work Group, which, as I said the other day, worked tirelessly despite their considerable day jobs to make this happen. So thank you all.